In 1934, the United States government asked an economist named Simon Kuznets to answer a specific question. The government asked how badly had the Great Depression hurt the economy, and by how much had it started recovering. Kuznets delivered his report to Congress, and inside it was the first version of what we now call gross domestic product. It was a crisis accounting tool designed to track the total dollar value of everything the country produced so that policymakers could see whether output was rising or falling. And right there in that same report, Kuznets included a warning. He wrote that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. He built the tool, and in the same breath he said, do not use this to judge whether people are actually doing well. That warning was ignored, and for the better part of 90 years, every major government on Earth has treated his measurement tool as the definitive score of human progress. The number a government produces when it calculates GDP tells you what its economy is generating, which is not the same thing as what its people are experiencing, and the distance between those two things has been quietly growing for over 50 years. GDP adds up the total market value of every good and service produced within a country's borders in a given year. Every transaction that passes through a market gets counted as a positive. More transactions means higher GDP. Larger transactions means even more higher GDP. That is the entire logic of the measure. And inside that logic is a problem that becomes visible the moment you ask, what kind of transactions are we counting? Let's look at an example. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, it destroyed over $100 billion in housing, infrastructure, and property, and then the reconstruction began. Materials were purchased, labor was hired, and billions were spent putting things back. That spending showed up in GDP as growth. The economy, by the only measure governments officially use, got better. More than 270,000 people were in emergency shelters at the peak, but the number went up. There is actually a name for this structural flaw in how GDP counts destruction. It is called the broken window fallacy. If you break a window, the glazier profits, the frame manufacturer profits, and economic activity ticks up. But you are not wealthier than before the window broke. You are back where you started, minus the time and the glass. GDP cannot see that difference. It does not see the difference between building something new and replacing something that was destroyed. And the man who built GDP told Congress in 1934 not to use it this way. And here we are, 90 years later, still using it exactly this way. But counting disasters as growth is only the first problem. The more consequential one is what GDP does with the gains when the economy actually works. There is a second failure that runs alongside the first, and this one has direct consequences for the majority of people in any given economy. GDP measures the total output of a country but says nothing about how that output is distributed. A country where the top 1% captures every dollar of new growth, and a country where every household gains equally can produce exactly the same GDP number. The number has no opinion about that distinction. The US economy is the clearest place to run this test. The 2008 recession officially ended in June 2009, and GDP started recovering. Over the 4 years that followed as the economy was technically growing, real median household income fell by 4.4%. But according to GDP, the economy was recovering while the typical American household was still getting poorer. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and GDP had no mechanism to show the contradiction, because it only adds and it never asks where the gains went. And the longer trend runs in the same direction. Since 1970, the top earners in America have consistently captured a growing share of national income, while the bottom half captured less, not because the economy stopped growing, but because GDP has no mechanism to track who the growth actually reached. The total kept rising. The number looked fine, but the distribution kept shifting. And this is not ancient history. Right now in 2026, the US economy is projected to grow at 2.2% for the year. At the same time, wages grew slower than inflation for the 12 months through April 2026, which means the typical worker lost purchasing power while the economy technically expanded. Around 7 in 10 Americans told CBS News pollsters they were struggling to afford food, housing, and healthcare. The GDP number does not contain any of that. It sees the transactions those struggles generate, the grocery bills, the medical debt, the rent payments, and it counts every one of them as evidence that things are going well. Then there is a third category of failure, and this one is arguably the most structurally important. GDP only counts market transactions, which means everything that happens outside of a market is invisible to it. Consider two households that are in an identical situation. In the first household, one parent stays home and cares for their children. They cook and manages the family. None of that labor enters a market, so none of it registers in GDP. In the second household, both parents work. They hire a nanny, a cleaning service, and eat at restaurants most nights. Every single one of those transactions enters the market and pushes GDP up. The children in both households are equally cared for. The actual work being done across both households may be nearly identical, but one contributes to GDP and one does not, which means one household makes the number look better even though nothing about real human welfare has improved. The same logic extends to everything from volunteering to environmental quality. If a city's air gets cleaner because a factory reduces emissions, GDP goes down because the factory is producing and selling less. If the factory keeps running and people develop respiratory illness and pay for treatment, GDP goes up because healthcare spending is a market transaction, which means the GDP number is not neutral. It is systematically biased toward activity that passes through markets, and it is systematically blind to what those transactions do to the people and environment around them. GDP sees only what gets bought and sold, treats all of it as equally good regardless of what it produces, and has no instrument for quality, distribution, or consequence. And the failure to count things correctly or to distribute what is counted fairly covers two of the three problems. The third is what the number cannot see at all, and that blindness has a name, which is where Kennedy comes in. On March 18, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy stood in front of 20,000 people at the University of Kansas and delivered what has become one of the most famous critiques of GDP ever recorded. He ran through everything the number counts that nobody would celebrate: pollution cleanup, prison construction, disaster spending, and then he said the number measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Kennedy was assassinated that June, which ended his presidential campaign and removed the political figure most associated with reframing what the economy was for. But the more structurally important reason the speech did not change anything is that by 1968, GDP was already deeply embedded as the operating metric of international finance. The Bretton Woods system, built after World War II, had wired GDP into the infrastructure of global lending, trade agreements, and institutional credibility. A government's GDP number was how it signaled to the world that it was a functioning economy. Changing the metric would have meant renegotiating the entire post-war financial architecture, and no individual speech was going to move that. There is also a more direct incentive problem here. GDP growth is the number that gets politicians reelected, that attracts foreign investment, and determines credit ratings. The people with institutional authority over economic policy have strong, concrete reasons to produce a rising GDP number and weaker reasons to produce a rising measure of median well-being or environmental quality. Kuznets warned them in 1934. Kennedy made the case publicly in 1968, but the number kept running the show, because the people running the show found it useful. The question that follows is whether any of this is actually fixable, or whether we are permanently stuck running a society off a number that was never designed for the job. Several countries and institutions have been running serious experiments. The United Nations Development Program launched the Human Development Index in 1990, which combines income, life expectancy, and years of education into a single composite score. The results produce a very different picture than GDP alone. Portugal ranks close to Qatar on the HDI despite having a per capita income that is roughly 1/3 of Qatar. The United States and New Zealand score identically on the HDI, both at 0.938, despite the US having a per capita income roughly 70% higher. What the HDI shows is that above a certain income level, additional GDP growth buys very little additional human development, because what determines development at that point is distribution and public investment, not raw output. The more comprehensive alternative is the genuine progress indicator, which starts with GDP as its base and then does two things GDP refuses to do. It adds the value of unpaid work like caregiving and volunteering, and it subtracts the costs of inequality, pollution, crime, and environmental degradation. When researchers applied GPI to New Zealand's economic history, they found that the country's GDP had grown by 91% since 1970, while its genuine progress, measured by GPI, had grown by only 53%. Almost half of what the GDP number was claiming as growth was activity that was either redistributing harm or replacing things that should not have been destroyed in the first place. New Zealand went further from there. In 2019, the government passed what it called a Wellbeing budget, which formally instructed government agencies to design policy around outcomes like mental health, child poverty, and environmental sustainability rather than around maximizing GDP growth. It was the first time a developed economy had moved the institutional machinery, not just the rhetoric, toward a different target. The problem is not that GDP exists, because measuring total output is useful for some things, and policymakers need quantitative tools. The problem is that a number designed to measure wartime industrial production became the primary definition of whether human societies are succeeding, and it did that not because it was the best available tool, but because it was convenient. It was embeddable in financial infrastructure, and it served the interests of the institutions that controlled it. What that leaves open is a question with no clean answer. If a measurement system systematically underreports the experience of the bottom half of any economy while accurately reporting the gains at the top, who does that serve? And does it serve them intentionally or just by accident?